Now starting. Story 1. The Curious Voyage of the World's First Rubber Ball. You are lying back, eyes half closed, listening not to the fan hum or the tick of a clock, but to the distant dripping of latex in a rain-soaked jungle. The world is still young in this story, not in centuries, but in industry. This is not the industrial age, not yet. It is a world of forests, obsidian blades, and tree sap. Specifically, Hevea brasiliensis, a tree that we now call the rubber tree. This is the tale of a ball. A quiet, bouncing, sacred little thing that would go on to shape entire economies and empires, though it began as nothing more than the hardened milk of a bleeding tree. The rubber tree, nature's secret. Deep within the Amazon basin, long before Europeans ever dreamed of crossing an ocean, indigenous communities had discovered something peculiar about the white sap oozing from certain trees. The tree's scientific name, Hevea brasiliensis, wouldn't come for millennia, but the tribes had other names for it, sacred ones, often tied to ritual and play. When cut, the tree bled a milky, sticky fluid that dried into something strange, not brittle like resin, not rigid like wood, but bouncy and flexible. It did not shatter when dropped. It deformed, then bounced back. It could be shaped, and more curiously, it could be played with. There was no word for polymer yet, no chemistry of cross-linking chains, just observation. Trees gave milk. The milk became solid. The solid became a ball. The ball could be thrown and it bounced. Olmecs in the first ball games. Now imagine the slow beat of distant drums. You are no longer in the Amazon, but in ancient Mesoamerica where, by 1600 BCE, the Olmecs had already figured out how to use this sticky latex in surprisingly advanced ways. The Olmecs, often called the mother culture of Mesoamerica, are credited with crafting the world's first rubber balls. These weren't simply toys. They were sacred objects used in a game that was part sport, part ritual, and occasionally part human sacrifice. The Alamalisli, the name given later by the Aztecs, was a ball game unlike anything seen in Europe or Asia. Players used hips, knees, elbows, and chests to keep a heavy rubber ball in motion, aiming to send it through a vertical stone hoop. These balls could weigh up to 9 pounds, 4 kg, and bounce dramatically, thanks to their unique material. Rubber became central to ritual and culture. It was used not just for balls, but also for sandals, bindings, figurines, and even waterproof textiles. Yet the process for making rubber usable wasn't just dripping latex. That substance alone, if left untreated, would grow brittle in the cold and sticky in the heat. The Mesoamericans figured out that mixing latex with the juice of the morning glory vine Ipomoea alba made the resulting rubber stronger and more elastic. They had, without knowing it, discovered a primitive method of vulcanization, over 3,000 years before Charles Goodyear. National trade and the slow spread of a secret. Despite its significance, rubber did not spread quickly. The Amazon basin and Mesoamerica were rich with the natural resources and knowledge to produce it, but the secret remained largely regional. Unlike metal or textiles, rubber wasn't suited to long journeys. In hot weather, it melted into a sticky goo. In cold weather, it cracked. Still, within the networks of trade between Mesoamerican societies Olmec, Maya, Toltec, and later, the Aztecs, rubber was a highly valuable commodity. The Maya, for instance, are known to have produced up to 16,000 rubber balls annually, a staggering figure when considering that each one required careful harvesting, mixing, and shaping. Rubber objects were traded across great distances, often alongside jade, cacao, feathers, and obsidian. These weren't quick, efficient trades. Days turned into weeks, weeks into months. Llamas didn't carry these goods, humans did, on foot, across forests, mountains, and dry plains. And yet, despite the arduous nature of the trade, rubber remained important not because it was utilitarian, though it was, but because it was symbolic. It represented play, fertility, divinity, even the passage between life and death in ritualized ball games. Medium everyday rubber, the boring but brilliant uses. Outside the court, rubber seeped into everyday life in quiet ways. Rubber sandals help protect the feet of messengers traversing rough terrain. Rubber adhesives were used to attach feathers to ceremonial costumes. Primitive waterproofing techniques, using rubber-infused cloth, help protect food and tools from the rain-heavy seasons of the tropics. These mundane applications may seem boring some souls, some glue, but they speak volumes about the material innovation of these ancient cultures. Rubber's slow, sticky adoption was not flashy. It was not conquering. It was subtle, creeping into the edges of life where water leaked, where tools needed grip, where protection was needed against the elements. These are the kinds of stories often lost in historical retellings because they are not loud. They are not dramatic, but they are necessary. Classical European blindness to the bounce. And then, as if distant thunder could not be heard beyond the mountains, came the Europeans. When Spanish conquistadors arrived in the early 16th century, they were astonished by the spectacle of the Mesoamerican ball game. Hernán Cortés himself reported witnessing such matches in the Aztec capital of Tenochtitlan. They saw the bouncy rubber balls and could hardly believe such a thing was possible. In Europe, there was no equivalent material. Nothing bounced like this. Nothing bent and returned to its shape. The concept of a ball was different, a leather bladder perhaps, or a wooden sphere. But this was something new. And yet here is the dull part. The Spanish largely ignored it. They were interested in gold, in silver, in religion and domination, not in bouncy materials of unknown composition. Rubber was strange, yes, amusing perhaps, but not profitable, not yet. So the knowledge of rubber, its uses, its rituals, its sacred games sat idle in European curiosity cabinets, reduced to a few sample balls and disjointed notes. It would take another 300 years before someone asked the next question: could this material be useful back home? From sacred game to forgotten curiosity. For the native peoples of the Americas, the rubber ball continued to serve in ritual and recreation. But the world was changing. The Spanish conquest wiped out entire populations. The sacred courts were silenced. The knowledge of mixing latex with morning glory sap began to fade. The games were banned or repurposed for entertainment stripped of meaning. Rubber fell back into the forest, bounced, and was lost in the undergrowth. Until, in a different century, on a different continent, a British scientist would pick up a small sample of coagulated sap and wonder what could be done with it. But that is a story for another section. You're no longer among the towering sabas and humid shadows of the Amazon. Now the year is 1736. The forests have faded. In their place, drawing rooms, powder wigs, quill pens. You're standing beside Charles Marie de la Condamine, a French scientist, explorer, and member of the Académie des Sciences. He's just returned from a grueling expedition to South America. But he hasn't brought back gold, nor spices, not even new animals. He's brought something far stranger, blackish, bouncy clumps of coagulated sap caoutchouc, as it was called by the indigenous people, and he is utterly fascinated by them. They bounce, they stretch, they smear, and they smell, well, not particularly pleasant. Rubber enters Europe barely. The Europeans had no idea what to do with this substance. La Condamine wrote to the Academy describing how rubber was used in the Americas to make boots waterproof, to craft bouncing balls, and to coat fabrics. But Europe's air was different, its temperatures more varied, and its commercial appetite centered elsewhere. Still, rubber balls became exotic novelties. By the late 1700s, small samples made their way into the salons of England and France. They were conversation pieces, oddities, curiosities to roll across a table and marvel at their elasticity. The first real use came in 1770, when British chemist Joseph Priestley discovered that the substance could erase pencil marks from paper. The term rubber comes from this function, a material that rubs out writing. But here, the boring part, the frustrating, slow, maddeningly meticulous part of history. It took another 60 years before rubber became anything more than an eraser or a children's toy. Test tube: the problem of rot. Rubber in its natural form is unstable, it's temperamental. In cold weather it becomes hard and brittle. In heat it melts into a sticky, smelly sludge. It rots, it molds, it sticks to itself and to everything else. European inventors, driven by the growing industrial revolution's hunger for flexible, waterproof materials, started experimenting. Thomas Hancock in England and Charles Mackintosh in Scotland were among the first to tinker seriously with rubber. In the early 1820s, Mackintosh invented a process for bonding rubber with cloth using naphtha, a solvent derived from coal tar. The result was the Mackintosh raincoat, a waterproof jacket that was both innovative and stinky. People wanted to love it, but the smell was terrible. The rubber would often melt in the sun or stiffen in cold wind. Clothes stuck together when folded. Factory workers handling raw rubber passed out from fumes. The whole process was erratic and unpleasant. By the 1830s, rubber was falling out of favor. Too unstable, too smelly, too weird. Still, demand lingered, especially in wet regions. People wanted waterproof boots, slickers, and seals. The idea of using rubber in machines as valves, gaskets, and tubing was growing. But the material wasn't ready. Something had to change. And that change came from a man with no formal education, crushed by debt, prone to manic dreams, and constantly tinkering in a homemade lab in Massachusetts. Fire Charles Goodyear and the accidental miracle. Charles Goodyear had been obsessed with rubber since the early 1830s. He believed, despite all evidence, that the material could be perfected. He experimented with additives: magnesium, turpentine, nitric acid, quicklime. Nothing worked. Then in 1839, in what can only be described as either fate or madness, Goodyear accidentally dropped a mixture of rubber and sulfur onto a hot stove. The rubber didn't melt. It charred slightly, yes, but when he examined it, he found that it had become elastic, resistant to temperature changes, and durable. He had stumbled upon vulcanization, though he didn't understand the chemistry of it. The term vulcanization came later, named for Vulcan, the Roman god of fire. The process involved heating rubber with sulfur, causing crosslinks between the polymer chains which stabilized the rubber. It no longer melted into goo in the summer or cracked in the winter. It bounced, it flexed, and it smelled slightly less horrible. Factory rubber goes industrial. With vulcanization, rubber finally became a serious material. Goodyear patented the process in 1844. Soon, rubber factories emerged in the United States and Europe. Products proliferated: shoes, hoses, belts, seals, gaskets, inflatable life vests, and even syringes. But there was a problem. Rubber was still only available from wild trees in the Amazon and Mesoamerica. Supply was limited, harvesting was difficult, and labor was, well, let's say coerced. The demand for rubber exploded, but its availability remained uncertain. By the 1850s, the rubber trade was becoming as vital as cotton or sugar, especially as industrial machinery began to rely on it for flexible joints and seals. Yet despite its economic impact, the story remained hidden in the details. Sap tapped by hand, men trudging through thick jungle, sheets of latex smoked over fires, loaded onto boats, and sailed thousands of miles to be processed in distant factories. Factories that, like most early industrial sites, were filled with long hours, child labor, no ventilation, and constant danger. Workers were burned by steam presses or poisoned by fumes, but the material was now indispensable. Canoe, meanwhile, back in the jungle. In the Amazon, the process of rubber harvesting was both brutally slow and incredibly manual. Rubber tappers, many of them indigenous or enslaved laborers, carved spiral incisions into trees and collected the latex in small cups. These trees had to be widely spaced to avoid disease, so harvesters walked for miles every day through mosquito-filled jungles, often barefoot, exposed to jaguars, parasites, and worse, the patros or overseers. The labor system, particularly in Brazil and Peru, began to resemble feudal bondage. Workers were indebted through inflated supply prices, kept in line by violence, and trapped in cycles of labor they could not escape. All this suffering so that a pair of waterproof boots could be sold in Liverpool, or a bicycle tire inflated in Paris. Luggage: Europe's quest for rubber control. By the late 19th century, European powers grew increasingly nervous about relying on Amazonian rubber. It was too far, too unstable, too slow. So they did what empires often do: they took it. In 1876, British explorer Henry Wickham smuggled 70,000 rubber tree seeds out of Brazil and delivered them to the Royal Botanic Gardens at Kew, near London. From there, seedlings were sent to British colonies in Ceylon, Sri Lanka, Malaya, and Singapore. These rubber plantations, meticulously planned, could grow trees in dense, uniform rows. Harvesting was easier, yields more predictable. Within decades, the Amazon lost its monopoly. This quiet act of biopiracy would trigger the eventual collapse of the Amazon rubber economy, a fall that would come violently and abruptly. But we are not there yet. The quiet rise of ordinary rubber. By 1900, rubber had become part of daily life across much of the world, in ways so mundane they were barely noticed. You tied your shoes' rubber soles. You opened a jar rubber gasket. You caught a train rubber insulation in wires. You received a letter rubber stamp. The material had seeped into the bones of modernity, and still few knew or cared where it came from or at what cost. The sacred ball game was long forgotten. The forests scarred, the factories choked with soot. Rubber had bounced from sacred ritual to silent infrastructure in just a few centuries. But this transformation wasn't yet complete. A darker chapter was waiting, one of colonization, brutality, and a king's insatiable greed. You are standing now not in a forest, but on the edge of a river, a wide, dark artery flowing silently through the heart of Central Africa. It's the late 19th century, and what lies before you isn't merely a landmass. It's a private empire, owned not by a government but by a man, King Leopold II of Belgium. This is the Congo Free State, though there is nothing free about it. And rubber, not gold, not ivory, is what fuels its cruelty. We have arrived at the most violent chapter in rubber's long and sticky journey. The moment when a sacred, bouncing ball becomes a commodity of conquest, and its harvest the cause of death for millions. Leopold's Rubber Kingdom. In 1885, King Leopold II secured international recognition for his private claim to the Congo Basin. Disguised as a philanthropic and scientific endeavor, the Congo Free State was marketed as a humanitarian colony meant to civilize, uplift, and educate. But Leopold had no interest in philanthropy. What he wanted, what he needed, was profit. And rubber, thanks to the bicycle boom in Europe and the invention of the pneumatic tire, had become extraordinarily valuable. Unlike British-controlled plantations in Southeast Asia, the Congo's rubber was wild, harvested from vines that grew in tangled forests, often far from navigable rivers. Gathering it required long treks, dangerous climbs, and brutal labor. Leopold created a system of forced quotas. Entire villages were given targets: collect a certain number of kilos of rubber per month or face mutilation, hostage-taking, or execution. Hands were cut off as punishment. Entire families were held as ransom to force men into the forest. Whips made from hippopotamus hide chicots were used to maintain order. The system was carried out by the Force Publique, a colonial army notorious for its cruelty. This wasn't an industrial operation. It was a system of terror with rubber at its center. Chart decreasing the numbers nobody wanted to count. How many died in Leopold's rubber empire? Estimates vary. Some historians suggest 10 million, others say 5 million, but no official census was taken and the Congo was vast larger than all of Western Europe combined. What we do know is this. Populations plummeted in rubber harvesting regions. Villages vanished from maps. Survivors bore scars, missing limbs or the trauma of lost families. And yet across the sea tires inflated, hoses coiled, belts spun in factories. Europe rolled on rubber, unaware or indifferent to the cost. It was a dark alchemy. Millions of lives converted into movement, speed, and the hum of industry. Megaphone, the world awakens slowly. By the early 1900s, reports of atrocities in the Congo began to surface. Missionaries, like George Washington Williams, and shipping agents like E.D. Morel began documenting the abuses. One of the most powerful voices was Roger Casement, an Irish diplomat who investigated the Congo and published the Casement Report in 1904. It contained chilling testimonies from survivors, photographs of mutilated villagers, and statistics showing sharp population declines. International outcry grew. Writers like Mark Twain and Arthur Conan Doyle condemned Leopold. Activists staged protests. Rubber was no longer just a product, it had become a symbol of exploitation. In 1908, under growing pressure, the Belgian government forced Leopold to cede control of the Congo Free State. It became the Belgian Congo, though exploitation continued under a new name. Rubber extraction in the Congo slowly declined as plantations in British and Dutch colonies, especially in Malaya and Sumatra, rose to dominance. Globe showing Asia, Australia, the plantation era, and globalization. With rubber seeds successfully transplanted from Brazil decades earlier, the British established vast plantations in Southeast Asia. These were more efficient in the eyes of the empire, easier to manage, easier to scale. Tens of thousands of Tamil and Chinese laborers worked these plantations under punishing conditions. They lived in dormitories, followed rigid schedules, and earned wages so small they could barely eat. Still, compared to the terror of the Congo or the backbreaking solitude of the Amazon, this was modernized colonial capitalism, disciplined, surveilled, and scaled. By 1914, 90% of the world's rubber came from plantations in Southeast Asia. The Amazon's trees were left behind. Ironically, disease, particularly South American leaf blight, began to wipe out rubber production in Brazil, making it impossible for wild rubber to compete. The jungle that had birthed the rubber ball returned to silence. The secret knowledge of the Olmecs and Maya, the ancient mixing techniques, the sacred games all receded. Oncoming automobile rubber powers the 20th century. Meanwhile, rubber had become essential to modern life. The automobile age depended on its tires, fan belts, gaskets. The airplane age, 2 seals, cockpit insulation, parachutes. In the 20th century, rubber entered everything: telephones, refrigerators, shoes, medicine. World wars accelerated the demand. During World War II, Japan seized many of the Asian rubber plantations, cutting off the Allied supply. The United States responded with an urgent effort to develop synthetic rubber, leading to breakthroughs that created materials like styrene butadiene rubber, SBR. By 1945, synthetic rubber was being produced by the hundreds of thousands of tons, and while it didn't replace natural rubber entirely, it changed the landscape. Today, over 60% of rubber used worldwide is synthetic, derived from petroleum. But natural rubber still has irreplaceable qualities, especially in tires, gloves, and certain high-performance materials. The bouncing ball has multiplied. It's in your shoes, your car, your plumbing, your medical devices, and its long, winding history clings to it, though we rarely notice. From sacred to silent, rubber's legacy. The journey of the world's first rubber ball is not a tale of triumph or tragedy alone. It is a story of transformation, a material shaped by humans, and in turn, shaping human history. What began as sacred sport in ancient Mesoamerica became commodity, weapon, industry, and eventually, infrastructure. The ball once passed between players in a dusty court under the gaze of gods. Later, it rolled off factory belts, shipped in boxes, inflating tires and powering wars. And today, it rests quietly beneath your steps, between your fingertips, inside machines you will never open. Rubber's story is the story of how something soft and forgotten becomes central, how the most mundane substance can carry a universe of suffering and innovation, silence and sound. And so, the ball has finished its bounce, but the echoes continue. What else lies hidden in the mundane materials of our world? What other quiet revolutions are still unfolding, unnoticed beneath our feet? Story 2. The monks who invented double-entry bookkeeping. You find yourself now in a quiet cloister. A candle flickers beside a worn wooden desk. The scratch of a quill on parchment is the only sound. This is no place of dramatic revelations or battlefield strategy. It is a scriptorium, a writing room in a medieval monastery, and the man hunched over the desk is not a king or warrior, but a monk. He's not writing poetry. He's not copying scripture. He's writing down expenses, the cost of a candle, the rent from a tenant's field, the number of eggs delivered to the kitchen this morning. This is bookkeeping, and it is here, among ink-stained fingers and dull wax stubs, that one of history's most transformative innovations was quietly born: double-entry accounting. Not in Florence or Venice, not yet, but in the shadows of medieval Europe's slow, steady shift toward order, logic, and long-term thinking. The origins: counting for God. Before double-entry accounting was formalized, there was always the need to track things: grain, livestock, taxes, tithes. Ancient civilizations did it using clay tablets and tally sticks. The Romans had ledgers. The Islamic world in the 9th century had sophisticated financial documentation. But in medieval Europe, after the fall of Rome and during centuries of decentralization, record-keeping was largely the domain of monasteries. Why? Because monks could read. Monasteries weren't just spiritual centers, they were economic hubs. They owned farmland, rented out property, bought and sold wine, managed mills, collected tithes, and even operated early banking functions such as holding deposits or making loans, sometimes controversially. They needed records, so monks developed ledgers, not necessarily because they loved math, but because they needed to know how many chickens the tenant had brought, or what the abbey owed the wool merchant in Flanders. Ledger: the Memoria and the Computus. Two key kinds of books dominated early monastic bookkeeping. Memoria, memorial books. These were simple lists. Expenditures, donations, incomes usually written in chronological order without much structure. It was a memory aid, not an analysis tool. Computus books. These were used to calculate the date of Easter and other liturgical events, but often included astronomical and financial calculations. Over time, Computus books began to reflect more complex reasoning, like aligning income and expenses with seasons, festivals, and tax dates. Some monasteries even recorded time worked by laborers, payments in kind, and the value of services rendered, such as sowing, shearing, and harvesting. These records were dull but precise. Here is an actual kind of entry you might find. On the 14th day of Michaelmas term, Brother Godric received 3 shillings and 4 pence from Geoffrey the smith, for the use of 1 mule and 2 sacks of barley. A tedious sentence, but for the monastery it meant food for the kitchen, wages for servants, or payment for parchment. Church monasteries as financial engines. By the 12th century, especially in places like England, France, and the Low Countries, monasteries had become some of the wealthiest landowners in Europe. The Cistercians, known for their rigorous discipline, operated massive farming estates. The Benedictines engaged in complex rent and tithe systems. These orders managed vast swaths of land and had to keep track of hundreds, sometimes thousands, of transactions every year. Bookkeeping became more than a convenience, it became a necessity. And while these early systems didn't yet include debits and credits in the modern sense, you could see the idea forming. Each transaction affected multiple parties and needed to be balanced. If the abbey paid a mason 5 pence for stonework, that wasn't just a loss, it was an improvement to property. A capital expense, we might say today. Monks began thinking in dual relationships, even if they didn't have a formalized method yet. Italy awakens, the rise of merchant bookkeeping. Now let's leave the monastery and step into a new space, the counting houses of 13th century Italy. Trade was flourishing in the city-states of Venice, Genoa, Florence, and Pisa. Merchants dealt in multiple currencies, with suppliers and clients scattered across the Mediterranean. Risk was constant, fraud was rampant, and trust required proof. Unlike the monasteries, merchants needed to calculate not just how much they had spent or earned, but how much they were owed, how much was invested, and where losses occurred. Thus emerged the Massari professional accountants, who worked alongside merchants to maintain not just memory books, but structured ledgers. These ledgers included the Giorno, a journal of transactions recorded as they occurred; the Quaderno, a ledger summarizing and classifying entries by type: debt, credit, asset, liability; the seeds planted in the monastery's structured records, precise dating, thoughtful categorization had now sprouted into a more complex system. Still, something was missing. A method to balance every entry with a counter-entry, a way to ensure that for every coin that left a chest, another line showed where it went. Writing Luca Pacioli, the monk who codified the system. And now we arrive at the man often, though somewhat inaccurately, credited with inventing double-entry bookkeeping, Luca Pacioli. Born in 1447, Pacioli was a Franciscan friar, mathematician, and teacher. He studied in Venice and taught across Italy, including in Perugia and Milan. He was friends with artists and intellectuals, including famously Leonardo da Vinci. In 1494, he published his most famous work, Summa de Arithmetica, Geometria, Proportioni et Proportionalita, a compendium of mathematical knowledge at the time. Hidden within it was a chapter titled Particularis de Computis et Scripturis, on accounting and record-keeping. Here, Pacioli didn't invent double-entry accounting, but he described it in a systematic, detailed, and teachable way. His method included: each transaction should have a debit and a credit. The books should always balance. Accounts should be recorded in a journal, then posted to a ledger. Inventories should be made at year's end. Errors should never be erased, but corrected visibly. It was essentially a manual for modern bookkeeping, clear, orderly, and rooted in logic. Pacioli was deeply influenced by earlier practices, monastic and mercantile, but he gave the system shape, discipline, and authority. Because of his status as a religious scholar and mathematician, his book was respected and widely read. Brain, why this boring innovation mattered so much. It's easy to overlook bookkeeping. It's tedious, quiet, monotonous. But double-entry accounting did something extraordinary. It allowed for abstraction. Instead of dealing only in physical coin or trade, merchants could now visualize the flow of money, debts owed, assets held, revenues pending. It made it possible to assess the true value of an enterprise, detect fraud or error, calculate profit and loss, prepare for future investments. In short, it turned commerce into a system of logic and foresight, rather than instinct and guesswork. And none of this would have been possible without the slow, meticulous work of monks tracking candle costs, field rents, and cart repairs centuries before merchants ever dreamed of overseas trade. The candle in the ledger. Let's return for a moment to that monk and his candle. His ink is smudged, his fingers ache, he's just written. 2 wax candles purchased for the vigil of St. Martin, at the cost of 1/2 groat. A tiny line, almost meaningless, but multiply that by hundreds of years, thousands of monasteries and millions of such entries, and you see the emergence of a pattern, a discipline. That monk wasn't inventing capitalism. He was simply being careful, but his care became structure, and structure became system, and system became the backbone of every business in the modern world. But why did it take so long for this system to spread? What held it back from becoming universal? And how did it finally become the default tool of modern finance? You're now sitting in a merchant's office in Venice around the year 1520. The windows are narrow, the ceiling high and dark. Papers litter the table, some in Italian, some in Latin. A sturdy leather-bound ledger lies open. A young assistant reads aloud the entries. Debited to cloth merchant in Flanders, 20 ducats. Credited to shipping broker for transport from Bruges. Each number, carefully written in red or black ink, serves not merely as a record, but as part of a balancing act, a quiet intellectual structure that underpins a growing world of trade, investment, and risk. This is not just paperwork. This is the skeleton of early capitalism. And yet, even as double-entry bookkeeping begins to shape the fortunes of merchants and city-states, it remains oddly limited in reach. Not every trader uses it. Not every city adopts it. Why? That's the next piece of our story. Why didn't everyone use double-entry right away? It might seem surprising that an idea as powerful and practical as double-entry bookkeeping didn't instantly revolutionize the world. But like all silent innovations, it spread slowly, cautiously, and unevenly. Some reasons: illiteracy and numeracy. Most people in 15th-16th century Europe were illiterate, let alone numerate. Writing and arithmetic were the domain of educated clerks, monks, or merchants who could afford private tutors. Bookkeeping wasn't just dull, it was difficult. Trust in memory and tradition. Many small traders trusted oral agreements and memory-based records. A notch on a stick, a whispered promise, a witness at the market stall, these were older than ink and felt more immediate than a complicated ledger. Lack of standardized currency. With dozens of currencies circulating, ducats, florins, pounds, silver bars, it was hard to maintain accurate ledgers. Without stable monetary units, even the best accounting system faced enormous friction. Suspicion of abstraction. Double-entry required an abstract mindset, understanding that a transaction could be both a debit and a credit, that money could be a number on paper before it ever changed hands. For many, this felt unnatural, even dishonest. Moral and religious tensions. The church had complex attitudes toward interest, usury, and profit. Though bookkeeping was common in monasteries, its use in commercial ventures was sometimes viewed with suspicion. Was it moral to calculate profit in this way? Did it encourage greed? Where it took hold first. Despite the challenges, double-entry bookkeeping found early traction in Italy, particularly in Venice, Genoa, and Florence. Why? These cities had robust trade networks, stretching from North Africa to the Levant to Northern Europe. Their merchants dealt with multiple currencies, long voyages, and joint ventures. They needed a clear method to track investment and repayment, especially in partnership models, which were becoming increasingly common. In particular, the Florentine Medici Bank, established in 1397, employed advanced accounting systems. Their agents, working in multiple branches across Europe, used ledgers to track capital flows and loan interest. Surviving documents show line-by-line records remarkably similar to today's accounting reports. Still, even here, double entry didn't become dominant overnight. The system slowly evolved from practical use, not from a single moment of adoption. The rise of the professional accountant. By the 16th century, a new class of professionals emerged: bookkeepers, accountants, and auditors. These were not merchants or monks. They were specialized workers who maintained the financial records of others. Their tools: journals, chronological transaction records; ledgers, classified account summaries; trial balances, to check if books balanced; inventories and balance sheets, often drawn up at year-end. In cities like Augsburg, Antwerp, and Nuremberg, these professionals served banking houses, manufacturing ventures, and trading syndicates. One of the earliest signs that accounting had become its own profession was the publication of textbooks. Besides Pacioli's Summa, we also see Jan Impen, 1547, published a Dutch guide that helped spread the method to the Low Countries. Benedetto Cotrugli, a Dalmatian merchant who described double entry decades before Pacioli, though his work wasn't widely circulated. These books weren't thrilling reads. They included long sample entries, instructional notes, and even ethics for how a good bookkeeper should behave: honest, sober, detail-oriented. Compass navigation, risk, and the need for precision. The age of exploration dramatically increased the need for reliable accounting. Voyages to the Indies, Africa, and the Americas were long, dangerous, and expensive. Investors needed clear records of who funded what cargo was loaded, and who was owed profits or restitution. Joint stock ventures like the Dutch East India Company, VOC, or the British East India Company depended on precise record-keeping. A single voyage might involve dozens of backers, ships loaded with varied cargo, spices, silver, cloth, long waiting periods for returns, unexpected losses, piracy, storms, failed markets. In this environment, ledger-based accountability was essential. Double entry made it possible to record advances given to ship captains, goods in transit, deferred income, partial repayments, depreciation of assets. It wasn't glamorous, but it made empire possible. Classical governments joined the ledger. As the commercial world matured, so too did state bureaucracy. Kings, queens, and parliaments began to hire accountants to track tax revenues, army expenses, and court spending. The French monarchy, under Louis XIV, employed bookkeepers to track the construction of palaces and military campaigns. The Dutch Republic used accounting to monitor canal construction and naval expenditures. The British Exchequer gradually adopted accounting standards to monitor colonial revenue. Governments, like monasteries centuries before, needed to know what they had, what they spent, and how much was owed. Eventually, the idea of balancing the budget became a political issue, not just a financial one. Wrench industrialization and standardization. In the 18th and 19th centuries, the Industrial Revolution demanded further refinement of accounting. Factories required inventory tracking, raw materials, finished goods, depreciation of machinery. Railroads required massive upfront capital, long payback periods, and ongoing maintenance costs. Corporations needed to report earnings to shareholders and investors. Suddenly, financial transparency was not just helpful, it was mandatory. New techniques emerged: cost accounting, tracking expenses per product or unit; depreciation methods, spreading asset costs over time. Capital and revenue distinctions, clarifying what was investment versus expense. From quiet monastery to roaring engine room, the ledger adapted. Fountain accountants become gatekeepers of trust. As financial systems grew, so did the power of accountants. In 1854, the Institute of Chartered Accountants of Scotland was formed, one of the earliest professional accounting bodies. By the 20th century, accountants were at the heart of corporate audits, government budgets, war financing, international lending. In many ways, they held the keys to modern trust. Their ledgers determined whether a business lived or died, whether a government was solvent, whether fraud could be exposed or buried. All of this grew, organically, from monks who needed to record candle costs and sheep counts. The invisible architecture of civilization. Today, double entry bookkeeping is everywhere, though few think about it. Each time you check your bank balance, run a payroll, receive a tax refund, or analyze a quarterly report, you're engaging with a system that has evolved over 1,000 years. Yet its heart remains simple. For every debit, a credit; for every action, a reaction; for every gain, a cost. It is, in a way, a reflection of natural balance, echoing the logic of physics, the rhythm of seasons, and the morality of fairness. But who ensures the ledger tells the truth? In the next section, we'll explore the rise of audit, financial scandals, and how accounting became a tool of both integrity and manipulation. Imagine a candlelit room in 18th century London. A merchant sits at his desk reviewing ledgers. Another man sits across from him, silent, pen in hand, ledger open. He is not a partner, he is not a banker. He is something new, an auditor. The books are balanced, but something feels off. An entry for barrels of molasses delivered to Jamaica. A payment made, but no receipt. The numbers add up, yet the story they tell feels wrong. This is where we now arrive in our quiet journey through the history of double entry bookkeeping. The moment when trust itself had to be verified, and the ledger became both a tool of transparency and deception. The rise of the auditor. As businesses grew larger and investors more distant, it became clear that even balanced books could hide falsehoods. A skilled bookkeeper could make losses look like profits, shuffle debts, delay expenses, and even fabricate assets without ever unbalancing the ledger. The double entry system, ironically, made fraud easier to hide because its form gave the illusion of precision. To counter this, companies and governments began appointing independent auditors outside parties who would examine journals and ledgers, verify that reported assets actually existed, check that revenues and expenses were real, not imagined, flag discrepancies or suspicious behavior. The earliest auditors were often retired clerks, local magistrates, or trusted professionals. By the mid-19th century, audit firms began to emerge in earnest. Adult balance, legal accountability, and public trust. The Industrial Revolution had brought with it railroads, factories, insurance companies, and crucially shareholders. These shareholders weren't involved in day-to-day operations, but depended on annual reports to assess their investments. This created a new tension: who speaks for the truth? Accountants had the numbers, executives had the motive, and auditors had the burden of verification. In 1844, the British Parliament passed the Joint Stock Companies Act, which required public companies to keep proper books and make them available to shareholders. Over time, new laws added requirements for annual audits, public balance sheets, disclosure of directors' pay and bonuses. The ledger, once hidden in the scriptorium or merchant office, was now a public object of scrutiny. Chart decreasing scandals in the ledger. Even with audits, scandals persisted. The very system designed to ensure trust became a battleground between truth and manipulation. Pushpin 1. The City of Glasgow Bank Collapse 1878. One of the earliest major accounting scandals. Directors concealed bad debts by falsifying books. When the bank failed, shareholders who had unlimited liability were ruined. Pushpin 2. The South Sea Bubble 1720. Not a traditional accounting scandal, but the event exposed how inflated reports and speculative bookkeeping could create economic mania, led to widespread calls for corporate regulation. Pushpin 3. Enron 2001. Fast forward to modern times. Enron's executives used off-book partnerships and manipulated financial statements to hide debt and inflate earnings. Their auditor, Arthur Andersen, signed off. Both companies collapsed. Thousands lost jobs, pensions, and savings. These scandals didn't happen because debentry failed, but because it was used expertly to deceive, to layer complexity upon complexity, and to hide lies beneath well-balanced columns. Brain the philosophy of the ledger. Here we pause to consider something deeper. The ledger, in theory, is a moral instrument. It assumes balance, that every cost must be matched with a source, that every benefit must be recorded. It assumes accountability. This isn't just arithmetic, it's ethics. Even the language we use today, being held to account, accountability, settling accounts, balancing the books, comes from this tradition. To keep a ledger is to accept that your actions can be recorded, reviewed, questioned. It is, in its own quiet way, an act of humility. But as we've seen, the ledger can be twisted, numbers can be massaged, losses can be buried. The books may balance, but the truth may not. Globe with Meridian's global standardization and the modern accountant. To address the growing complexity of financial life, the 20th century saw a push toward global accounting standards. GAAP, Generally Accepted Accounting Principles, U.S. IFRS, International Financial Reporting Standards, Global. These frameworks created common rules for revenue recognition, asset depreciation, debt classification, disclosure of risk. Accountants today are trained in these frameworks, and audits are mandatory for large public companies. Auditing itself has become a massive global industry, dominated by firms like Deloitte, PwC, KPMG, and EY, the so-called Big Four. And yet scandals persist. Receipt, the human behind the ledger. Throughout all of this, one constant remains: the human. Behind every entry is a person, a decision, a motive, a hope, or a fear. The monk calculating candle costs in the 12th century. The merchant hiding a debt in 1603. The clerk misclassifying revenue in 1987. The auditor raising concerns that no one listens to. The ledger is only as honest as its keeper. Counterclockwise arrows button, the moral of the entry. So what has this long, quiet journey taught us? That boring details matter: a missing receipt, a mismatched entry, a duplicated expense. That history is shaped not just by grand battles and bold speeches, but by rows of ink on parchment and spreadsheets on servers. That order, when carefully kept, can illuminate truth, and when abused, can conceal it more efficiently than chaos ever could. It's not dramatic, it doesn't make for thrilling cinema, but it is essential. Books from scroll to spreadsheet. Today, debentry accounting underpins corporate budgets, tax systems, government finance, personal banking apps, nonprofit audits, cryptocurrency ledgers, entire national economies. What began with candle costs and chicken counts now regulates trillion-dollar global markets. And yet the rules are still the same. Debit this, credit that, balance everything, be honest. And perhaps the deepest question remains: can a system designed for fairness truly resist human attempts to cheat it? Story 3. The Postal Riders of the Ottoman Empire. Close your eyes and listen for the sound of hoofbeats. Not in a gallop, but in a steady, pounding rhythm across packed earth. It's the 16th century, and you're standing on the edge of a narrow road just outside Bursa, in the Ottoman Empire. A rider approaches not armored, not armed, but determined. Across his saddle, a leather satchel bulges with scrolls, documents, and sealed pouches. He slows only to change horses, exchange a token, and continue. He is part of something deceptively simple, yet critically important: the ULAC, the courier network of the Ottoman Empire. You've likely never heard of him, but he is the reason laws were enforced, taxes collected, and rebellions contained. The Ottoman postal rider may be a footnote in history, but he was a living line of connection through one of the most sprawling empires the world has ever known. This is his story. The vast body of an empire. At its height in the 16th and 17th centuries, the Ottoman Empire stretched from the gates of Vienna in the west to the Persian Gulf in the east, from the steppes of Ukraine in the north to the deserts of Arabia and the coasts of North Africa in the south. This immense body had dozens of languages, hundreds of ethnic groups, mountain ranges, deserts, marshlands, and cities, governors, judges, tax collectors, and armies. But how did it all hold together? Not through magic, not even solely through religion or military strength. It held together through a network of communication, a lifeline of parchment, ink, and rider. Postal horn, the early origins of Ottoman communication. Before the Ottomans, the Byzantines and Seljuks had developed rudimentary courier systems, but the Ottomans refined and expanded them into a sophisticated relay network, carefully designed for long-distance control. The system was known as the Menzil Teşkilatı, the Relay Post Organization. It worked like this. A network of relay stations, called menzils, was established at regular intervals, typically every 35 to 50 kilometers. Each station housed spare horses, shelter for riders, food, and a station keeper, often a local notable under state contract. Couriers, known as ulaklar, would carry official messages from station to station, switching to fresh horses each time to maintain speed. Messages could travel hundreds of kilometers in a matter of days, a remarkable feat for the time. Horse, the ulak, empire's quiet agent. The ulak was not a soldier, yet he was trained to endure harsh weather, long hours, and dangerous terrain. He had to be literate, at least partially, physically fit, reliable to a fault. He carried an official imperial credential, often sealed or stamped, which granted him the right to commandeer horses, bypass tolls, and demand assistance at stations. Some ulaks carried urgent orders from the Sultan. Others bore provincial reports, military plans, or tax tallies. One might ride from Damascus to Istanbul. Another might climb through snowy Anatolian passes to deliver census records. Each journey mattered. Their duties were not glamorous, and they left few records, but they were trusted to hold the empire together, one message at a time. Houses, the Menzil station, a node in the network. Menzils weren't grand buildings. Most were humble caravanserais, inns built for travelers and merchants, often run by local contractors known as menzilsi. A typical station had a few rooms for sleeping, stables with fresh horses, grain storage, water tanks or wells, sometimes a small mosque or prayer room. To be a station keeper was an honor but also a responsibility. You had to maintain a stable of government-registered horses, feed and house ulaks free of charge, ensure readiness 24/7, keep logbooks of who passed through. Failure to meet standards could result in fines or dismissal. And yet, station keepers were rarely paid directly. Instead, they were given tax exemptions or land privileges. It was a barter-based administrative system designed to keep state costs low and loyalty high. Scroll paperwork, the engine behind the saddlebags. Every journey was accompanied by paperwork. Riders carried imperial firman's decrees, reports from provincial governors' bailorbies, financial records and court decisions from the Cadi Islamic judge. These documents were usually written in Ottoman, Turkish, a hybrid script using Arabic script but Turkish syntax, marked with seals to prevent tampering, folded carefully into narrow scrolls, and wrapped in protective oilcloth. The Ottoman bureaucracy kept duplicate registers of all official communications. Some were filed in provincial archives, others in Topkapi Palace, home of the Sultan. This method ensured a paper trail that could be traced months or years later if needed evidence that governance had occurred, or that rebellion had been warned of. Pushpin messages that mattered. Not every message was equal. Some carried life-or-death importance. In order to quell a tax revolt in Syria, a report of plague in a port city, a weather delay affecting grain transport, a decree announcing a new judge for a disputed district. Speed was everything. Certain riders carried special markings that classified their dispatches as urgent. They could override station rest protocols and were sometimes accompanied by janissary escorts in volatile regions. There was even a practice of recording timestamps at each menzil to track how long a dispatch took. Delays could lead to investigations. If a message reached Istanbul too late, it might mean a battle lost, a governor replaced, or a disaster misunderstood. Mantelpiece punctuality and penalties. The empire had a set delivery timetable for major cities. Aleppo to Istanbul, days. Baghdad to Istanbul, days. Cairo to Istanbul, tilde 30 days. Delays without valid reason were treated as state failures. Investigators, often drawn from the Janissary Corps or financial officials, would audit the route. A missing horse, a corrupt station keeper, or an overburdened courier could be punished. The system was rigid, even by early modern standards, but it worked. By the 17th century, the Ottoman relay system was rivaled only by the Persian and Mughal networks, and often exceeded them in scale and reach. The hidden importance of the boring message. The ulak's job was not to innovate or decide, it was to deliver. That might sound dull, mundane even, but that is precisely why it mattered. Because empires don't collapse from drama, they rot from silence. A decree that isn't delivered becomes a policy, never enforced. A tax tally that doesn't reach the capital becomes revenue lost. A plague report delayed becomes a city abandoned too late. Behind every imperial decision was a message. Behind every message was a rider. Behind every rider was a station, a horse, a path dusty, dull, and essential. But what happened when the world changed? When roads fell into disrepair, when armies grew impatient, or when couriers were outpaced by newer technologies? The horse has stopped, the message is late, and the empire notices. In the Ottoman world, where distance could mean rebellion and a delayed decree might cost thousands of lives, the efficiency of the ulak courier system was not simply administrative, it was existential. And yet, as vast and resilient as the network was, the system carried within it the seeds of its own limits. Dusty roads wore thin, human error crept in, and eventually the world began to move faster than the hooves that once held it together. This section explores what happens when a communication system, designed in the age of scrolls and saddlebags, begins to struggle against the pressure of early modernity. Roadblocks, the physical strain on the network. The Ottoman postal system relied on physical infrastructure, roads, horses, stations. And while the imperial center in Istanbul tried to ensure regular maintenance, in practice, things broke down. Major challenges included weather extremes. Snow-blocked high passes in Anatolia. Summer heat-cracked roads in Syria and Mesopotamia. Flooded rivers made some menzils unreachable for weeks. Geographic obstacles. Mountains in the Balkans. Desert expanses in Arabia. Dense forests in parts of Eastern Europe. Inconsistent maintenance. Some stations thrived, others languished. Horses were underfed or overworked. Roads that hadn't seen repairs in decades turned into muddy traps in the rainy season. Despite imperial orders, local corruption or neglect often undermined the system. A lazy station keeper might delay dispatches. A dishonest one might sell off government rations intended for riders. Such inefficiencies were difficult to police across a territory that took weeks to traverse. Crossed interference and interruption. Beyond environmental and logistical challenges, the courier system faced interference from both within and outside the empire. 1. Banditry. Highways were not always safe. In provinces with weak central control, couriers were targeted for their documents or simply as symbols of the state. Some ulaks disappeared entirely lost to theft, murder, or desertion. 2. Rebellion and war. During uprisings, like the Jalali revolts in Anatolia, many menzils were destroyed or taken over. Provincial lords, known as ayan, sometimes delayed or intercepted messages to assert independence or disrupt rival factions. 3. Sabotage by elites. Some governors tampered with courier routes to delay unpleasant orders, such as audits or tax assessments. There are recorded cases of forged firmans reaching city, a sign that control over communications was slipping in certain regions. Abacus when the ledger fails. Delays and bureaucratic confusion. The Ottoman state was obsessed with records, each dispatch logged, each receipt stamped, but even this paper trail could collapse under stress. Messages were often misrouted due to copying errors, delayed when scribes didn't transcribe clearly, misunderstood due to regional dialects or vague language. In one recorded case, an order meant to increase tax collection in Bosnia was misread as a command to reduce it. The mistake wasn't discovered until nearly a year later when revenues collapsed. The problem wasn't bad intent. It was the sheer scale of the operation. Every order had to travel through layers of official scribes, station keepers, writers, secretaries. A delay at any one point disrupted the whole sequence. Hourglass done pressure of speed in a slower A. As the empire grew older and Europe modernized, the Ottoman communication network began to feel slow. In France, the Cabinet Noir and centralized courier service allowed the monarchy to spy, censor, and respond to news with unprecedented speed. In Russia, reforms under Peter the Great began to emphasize faster postal relay and more detailed tracking. The Ottomans, while aware of these developments, were slow to adopt them. The reasons were mundane. Limited funding for infrastructure. Decentralized governance in many provinces. Suspicion of centralizing power in communications, lest it threaten local elites. For an empire that once outpaced its rivals, the Menzil Teşkilatı became a system of dignified delay reliable in peacetime, but sluggish in crisis. Bell the introduction of the European-style postal system. By the early 19th century, reformers within the Ottoman government began to push for modernization. These included members of the Tanzimat movement, 1839-1876, who sought to reshape the empire along European lines. Their proposals included a state-run postal authority open to private citizens, not just government officials, printed stamps and standardized rates, timetable deliveries modeled after the British and French systems, expansion of services to cities like Beirut, Aleppo, Thessaloniki, and Cairo. In 1840, the first official Ottoman postal service for the public was launched. It coexisted with the older ulak system for a time, but the writing was on the wall. Messages once carried by riders in oilcloth satchels now arrived in sealed envelopes, often aboard steamships or rail cars. Locomotive railroads and the death of the hoof. The introduction of railroads in the Ottoman Empire, particularly during the mid-19th century, dealt a final blow to the courier on horseback model. In 1860, the Istanbul-Edirne Railway linked major cities in the Balkans. By the 1890s, the Hejaz Railway connected Damascus to Medina, cutting travel time dramatically. Postage now moved not in leather pouches, but in steel mailbags on iron rails. The empire that had once measured its messages in days on horseback could now deliver a letter in hours. The ulak became redundant not overnight but gradually. Fewer riders were trained. Menzil stations were converted or abandoned. Horses gave way to engines. It wasn't a betrayal, it was simply efficiency catching up. What was lost? And yet something was lost. The human chain of communication was broken. Station keepers, once respected, became obsolete. Rural areas not reached by rail were left behind. The personal knowledge that ulaks had of terrain, dialects, and people faded. The new system was faster but colder. It relied on machines, not memory, on paper routes, not lived experience. To the state, it was progress, but to the men who had once carried the empire's voice across the dust, it was the end of a way of life. But what do we inherit from this vanished system today? We'll explore the long-term impact of Ottoman communication systems, how echoes of the ulak remain in modern logistics, and what their legacy tells us about building resilient empires quietly, one message at a time. The hoofbeats have stopped, but the roads remain. The Ottoman ulak is long gone, no more leather satchels slung over tired shoulders, no more night rides through muddy mountain passes. But in his dust, something endures. This is not a story of collapse. It's a story of transmission, of how a quiet, stable, decentralized relay system shaped the modern communication and logistics world, often invisibly. In this final section, we look beyond the rider. We explore what the ulak, the menzil, and the bureaucracy that depended on them left behind in statecraft, infrastructure, and the very way we think about information. The Ottoman network as a pre-modern internet. Long before fiber optic cables and 5G towers, there existed another kind of network built on roadbeds and horses, stations and schedules, ink and trust. In many ways, the Ottoman relay system functioned like a slow-moving internet. Messages were routed between nodes, menzil stations. Couriers were the packets, moving data across vast distances. Official stamps and seals functioned as encryption and verification. Timestamps ensured data integrity. Stations had logs of who sent what, and when, primitive but effective metadata. This framework wasn't abstract. It was deeply physical, deeply human. And though slow by today's standards, the system achieved predictable communication across territories that spanned deserts, mountains, and seas without electricity, without telegraph wires, and without modern transportation. Bricks infrastructure that shaped settlement. The Menzil Teşkilatı left more than paper and memory. It left buildings, roads, and patterns of human habitation. Many modern Turkish towns trace their origins to old postal relay stations. Caravanserais and Menzilhane buildings still stand, now used as inns, museums, or shops. Routes developed around the needs of couriers, flat terrain, access to water, shelter. In places where there was no economic incentive to build, the state built anyway because messages had to get through. This led to rural integration long before telecommunications. Much like Roman roads, Ottoman relay paths influenced military strategy, commerce, and religious pilgrimages. Over time, merchants and travelers followed the same routes as couriers because they were trusted. Even today, major highways in Anatolia and the Balkans follow traces of these ancient relay roads. Adult briefcase, a culture of documentation and trust. The Ottoman bureaucracy is often mocked for being slow, labyrinthine, or overregulated. But that bureaucracy centered around reliable communication became the empire's most durable inheritance. Every ulak carried not just a message, but an expectation. That communication could be official and traceable. That authority could be exercised through writing. That the state could speak, even in its most distant provinces, without physically being there. This principle continues in the modern Turkish Republic and other post-Ottoman states, where meticulous record-keeping remains a strong cultural norm. Court transcripts, land deeds, property disputes all rely on a paper trail tradition stretching back centuries. This legacy persists even in digital forms today. Government portals, public tenders, and civil records in Turkey and many Balkan states are built on deeply embedded expectations of orderly documentation, classical administrative delegation, and local trust. One of the most overlooked innovations of the Menzil system was its use of decentralized accountability. Rather than centrally managing every station, the empire relied on contracted station keepers, often drawn from local elites or merchant families. This system reduced central costs, encouraged local investment in maintaining infrastructure, created informal layers of local governance. This balance between centralized authority and local autonomy is echoed in modern federal systems, particularly where postal, transport, or police powers are locally administered under national guidelines. We often think of imperial systems as rigid and top-down, but the Ottoman courier network shows us how delegated trust, if properly monitored, can scale. Dove diplomatic and military ripples. The ulak system also influenced 1. Diplomatic communication. Ottoman envoys and foreign ambassadors often relied on the Menzil routes for secure travel and correspondence. Embassies in Istanbul would coordinate through these channels, establishing early norms for international dispatches. 2. Military logistics. Commanders used the system to request reinforcements, report on campaigns, or receive battlefield instructions. It prefigured modern military supply chains, with staged movements of men and material relying on relay points. Even the pilgrimage route to Mecca, the Darb al-Hajj, was supported by these networks. It ensured that messages could reach the holy cities with the same efficiency as tax documents. Counterclockwise arrows button the slow transformation. The ulak didn't vanish in a day. Some continued in remote areas, even into the early 20th century. Their routes were repurposed by telegraph lines, which followed the same geography. Their buildings became post offices under the modern PTT, Posta-Telgraf Telefon, in the Turkish Republic. The transformation was not destruction, but evolution. The role of the courier was absorbed into new technologies: telegraph, then telephone, then wireless communication. Still, the ideals remained: timely delivery, reliability under hardship, trust in record-keeping, public infrastructure serving state function. From horseback to broadband, the bones of the system still carry weight. Thought balloon: the forgotten value of the boring. Why do we remember sultans, but not couriers? Perhaps because the work of the ulak was deliberately invisible. They didn't command armies or pass judgments. They moved quietly through forests, across bridges, through dust storms, carrying the pulse of empire in silence. But history, if listened to carefully, rewards the boring. The Ottoman postal riders may not have left monuments, but they connected monuments. They did not write decrees, but they ensured those decrees had power. They are history's living infrastructure, the kind that allows civilization to whisper across space and time. Reflection, the state between stations. The ULAC teaches us that no empire, no system, no organization survives without communication. And communication is not abstract, it is sweat, schedules, paperwork, and pathfinding. As modern society grapples with the speed and overload of digital communication, the Ottoman model reminds us of another kind of system, one that prized order over haste, consistency over speed, and above all, connection over isolation. In an age where a message can travel around the world in a second, perhaps there is something worth admiring in the man who once rode for 3 weeks, just to deliver one sealed envelope, and did so without fail. Story 4. The Forgotten Brickmakers of Roman Londinium. You are walking along a muddy path near the River Thames, but the year is not 2025, it is 120 CE. The air smells faintly of smoke and damp earth. Behind you, a slow, gray river winds toward the sea. Ahead, the outskirts of a Roman provincial town are rising, brick by brick, wall by wall. This is Londinium, the Roman bridgehead in Britannia. But we are not following generals or governors. Not today. This story belongs to the brickmakers, the quiet hands who built the walls, the baths, the warehouses, and the roads. Forgotten in stone, but essential to empire. Their work was repetitive, dirty, crucial. Without them, Londinium would be no more than a dream carved in the minds of Roman engineers. The rise of brick in the Roman West. Brickmaking was not invented by the Romans, but they refined it into a state-sponsored, standardized system. In the early centuries of the Roman Empire, particularly from Augustus onward, brick became a dominant building material, especially in territories where stone was scarce or hard to quarry. In Italy, fired clay bricks had become the norm. In Britannia, the Romans introduced brickmaking after the conquest in 43 CE, spreading it through their military infrastructure, forts, bathhouses, villas, and temples. Why brick? Durability. Properly fired bricks could last centuries. Transportability. Bricks could be made near the site, reducing the need to haul stone. Standardization. Uniform bricks made for easier, faster construction. Labor-intensive, but not skill-intensive. Slaves, soldiers, and local laborers could be trained to produce bricks quickly. And so, in Londinium, on the marshy, flood-prone land near the Thames, brick kilns began to rise. Building Londinium, one brick at a time. Roman Londinium was more than just a frontier town, it was a logistical hub, built with Roman precision and urban planning. By the early 2nd century CE, it had a forum and basilica, the largest north of the Alps, stone quays and warehouses along the Thames, a governor's palace, a massive amphitheater, public baths, a grid of paved roads, defensive walls eventually. And all of these required millions of bricks. Clay deposits near the Thames were abundant and easy to access. Workers dug shallow pits, often less than a meter deep, and mixed clay with water, sand, and sometimes crushed ceramics or straw to improve consistency. Once formed in wooden molds, the bricks were left to dry in the open air for days or weeks, depending on the weather. Then they were fired in kilns, carefully stacked with gaps for hot air to pass through. The process was tedious, weather-dependent, and always at risk of failure. A single improperly fired batch could crumble under pressure. Too little heat and the bricks remained soft. Too much and they cracked. Brickmakers became masters of temperature, timing, and tedium. Classical stamped in time, the brickmarks of Rome. Many Roman bricks carried stamps, impressions made with wooden or metal dies while the clay was still soft. These marks tell us more than just who made them. They reveal the manufacturer, often a military unit or a state. The date, sometimes by consular year. The location, the name of a local kiln or estate. The supervisor, a slave, freedman, or official overseeing production. One such stamp found in Londinium reads, Leg XXVV. This refers to Legio XX Valeria Victrix, a Roman legion stationed at Deva, modern-day Chester, that provided troops for construction projects. It suggests that soldiers themselves may have made the bricks or at least supervised the labor. Other stamps bear names of imperial estates or private entrepreneurs, indicating that the Roman state contracted brick production to both military and civilian providers. These stamps are the signatures of the forgotten clues to a silent workforce that left no memoirs, no monuments, only marks in clay. Adult medium, who were the brickmakers. Most Roman bricks weren't made by architects or citizens. They were shaped by slaves owned by the state or wealthy Roman landowners. Freedmen, often former slaves who remained attached to brick-producing estates. Soldiers, especially from engineering cohorts Fabri, in the Roman army. Local Britons, hired or conscripted labor, trained on site. This work was not considered honorable. It was repetitive, exhausting, and anonymous. Brickmakers lived near the kilns, which were usually on the outskirts of towns to avoid smoke and fire hazards. Their days were dictated by weather, supply chains, and the rhythms of imperial demand. If a bathhouse needed new tiles, if a wall needed repairs, or if a governor ordered a new warehouse, production increased overnight. Some workers became skilled molders or kiln masters, but their names are mostly lost. Their legacy is not in history books, it is in walls. Fire the kiln, where earth met empire. Kilns were the heart of brickmaking operations. In Roman Londinium, they came in several forms. Clamp kilns. Temporary, open-air piles of bricks surrounded by burning material, wood, charcoal. Cheap but risky, uneven heating often resulted in waste. Updraft kilns. More sophisticated, with fire pits below and chambers above. Heat rose through flues, providing more even firing. Could operate year-round, making them ideal for urban supply. Some kiln sites in and around Londinium have been excavated. One in Waddling Street, dating to the 2nd century CE, contained layers of burnt clay, ash, and partially fired bricks, evidence of both success and failure. Kilns were dangerous. Fires occasionally burned out of control. Workers suffered from smoke inhalation, burns, and long-term respiratory damage, but they were essential. Without the kiln, there was no city. Dull but durable, the hidden strength of brick. Roman bricks weren't flashy. They lacked the grandeur of marble or the beauty of mosaic, but they had one superpower: endurance. Long after Londinium was abandoned in the early 5th century CE, its bricks remained. Anglo-Saxon settlers saw them in ruins and used them for road building. Medieval masons stole them from collapsed bathhouses to build churches. Some bricks from Roman Londinium are still in use today, recycled, reshaped, reborn. They last because the hands that made them respected the dull details. The right Santa-clay ratio. The timing of the fire. The spacing in the stacks. The drying time after rain. Every boring decision made by a nameless worker 1,900 years ago contributed to a material that still holds up. But what happens when an empire's hands are pulled away? In the next section, we'll follow the decline of Roman Londinium, the collapse of its building trades, and how brickmakers vanished into mud as the city was slowly forgotten, only to be unearthed centuries later. It begins with silence. No trumpet calls, no invasion at the gate, just fewer wagons on the road, fewer voices in the forums, and smoke no longer rising from the kiln fields beyond Londinium's edge. The story of decline is rarely dramatic. It unfolds slowly, one neglected wall, one unfired batch of bricks at a time. In this section, we witness the waning days of Roman Londinium, And what happened when the hands that shaped the city's future stopped working clay and started burying it? The tipping point, decline in the 3rd century. By the mid-3rd century CE, Londinium, once bustling with trade, construction, and civic ambition, was already beginning to slow. Signs of trouble. Trade disruptions across the Channel weakened the city's economy. Repeated Saxon raids made urban life dangerous. Political instability in Rome meant less imperial oversight and fewer resources. Coinage devaluation caused wages to shrink and inflation to rise. Public building projects ceased, leaving kilns idle and laborers unemployed. Construction didn't stop overnight, but it shifted. New buildings were smaller, less ambitious. Repairs replaced expansion. Recycled materials became common, bricks from old bathhouses reused in walls, a practice known as spolia. Brickmakers adapted, but with fewer orders and less official demand. Many left the trade. Others returned to agriculture or joined the growing number of people, abandoning urban life altogether. The kilns, once the heartbeat of Londinium's expansion, began to cool. Derelict, the abandonment of Londinium. By the early 5th century, the Roman Empire was pulling out of Britain. Garrisons were recalled, administrators left, and tax collection, already weakening, collapsed entirely. Without the state, roads fell into disrepair. Public baths closed. Markets dwindled. Civic buildings were looted for building material. Londinium's carefully laid bricks were now building blocks for survival, not for style. The city was largely abandoned by 410 CE. Brickmakers had no more clients. The art of firing consistent, durable bricks faded quickly, replaced by wooden huts, wattle and daub, and rudimentary structures. A technological reversal. It's tempting to think of history as a straight line of progress, but what followed Rome's departure from Britain was not advancement, it was simplification. Between the 5th and 9th centuries, brickmaking as an industry disappeared in most of Britain. Why? Lack of centralized administration to fund or require durable infrastructure. Shrinking populations that could not sustain skilled labor. Loss of technical knowledge how to build kilns, select clay, control firing temperatures. New social values, function over permanence, mobility over stone. This wasn't collapse in the Hollywood sense. It was slow, practical erosion. The kilns crumbled, the wooden molds rotted, the fire pits filled with weeds. It would be centuries before England saw brickmaking return at a comparable scale. Magnifying glass tilted left what survived beneath the soil. Centuries passed. Londinium became Londonwick, then Londonburg, and finally London. Roman roads were buried. Roman bricks were scavenged or forgotten. But under the growing city, the past remained. In the 19th and 20th centuries, archaeologists began to uncover the story of Londinium's brickmakers, one layer of soil at a time. What they found: kiln remains in Southwark and the Walbrook Valley. Stamped bricks with legion marks and estate names. Discard pits filled with misfired or cracked bricks, evidence of learning, trial, and error. Abandoned workspaces containing tool, molds, and ash deposits. Each artifact revealed the rhythm of Roman brickmaking: repetition, precision, labor. It wasn't glamorous, but it was consistent. It built not just walls, but stability. Bricks recycling the past. Even after the fall of Londinium, its bricks found new life. Medieval builders repurposed Roman bricks for abbey walls, manor hearths, castle footings. Some early English churches, especially in Kent and Essex, contained bricks made by Roman hands centuries earlier. This reuse wasn't just practical, it was also symbolic, a connection to a past that still radiated authority. Roman brick wasn't just durable, it was respectable. It's possible that many of the people who reused these bricks had no idea how they were made. The knowledge of proper brick firing techniques had vanished, but the results had not. In this way, the work of anonymous brickmakers survived their own forgotten era. Chart decreasing the loss of technical knowledge. One of the subtler tragedies of post-Roman Britain was the loss of expertise. Imagine a skilled kiln master who knows by scent and smoke when a fire is too hot. A laborer who can judge clay quality by touch alone. A worker who has perfected the rhythm of stacking bricks to optimize airflow in the kiln. Now imagine those people growing old, their children uninterested, the demand gone, their tools rust, their kilns collapse, their skills die with them. This is how knowledge vanishes not with fire, but with quiet neglect. Brickmaking became a forgotten craft in post-Roman Britain, relegated to memory, myth, and eventually, to the interest of scholars and hobbyists. Receipt paper trails and excavation journals. One of the few ways we've pieced together the story of Londinium's brickmakers is through the dull but precious paperwork of archaeology. Site reports, field sketches, soil samples, radiocarbon dating logs, kiln reconstruction models. These documents, though rarely read by the public, have revealed how bricks were standardized, which legions or contractors operated specific sites, how firing temperatures evolved over time, where clay deposits were exploited most efficiently. Once again, boring history tells the deeper truth, not the battles but the buildings, not the emperor's words but the bricklayer's routine. A silent legacy. We don't know the names of the brickmakers of Londinium, but we know their hands shaped the foundation of what would become one of the greatest cities on earth. Their bricks outlived their politics. Their craft was so stable, so effective, that it needed no embellishment. And perhaps this is the purest form of legacy, to shape the future without needing to be remembered for it. But what brought brickmaking back? How did England rediscover the craft it had lost? And what role did Roman techniques play in shaping modern British architecture? It's the 13th century. A mason stands beside a crumbling wall in Kent, chiseling mortar from a strange, hard red brick. It doesn't match the stone around it. It's flatter, more regular, more Roman. He doesn't know who made it. He doesn't know that it was fired over 1,000 years earlier, perhaps in a smoky kiln along the Thames. All he knows is that it's strong, stronger than anything he can make himself. So he pries it free, loads it onto a cart, and carries it to a nearby priory, where it will become part of a wall, a floor, or a vault. And so brick returns not by invention, but by imitation and reclamation. This final section explores the slow revival of brickmaking in post-Roman Britain, and how the forgotten hands of Londinium's brickmakers helped shape a modern building tradition that still echoes today. The long sleep of the kiln. After the Roman withdrawal in the early 5th century, brickmaking largely vanished from Britain. Over the next 800 years, most construction relied on timber framing, wattle and daub, rubble masonry, fieldstone and flint. Brick was simply too complex, too labor-intensive, and too dependent on stable economies and skilled laborers. But a few things kept Roman brick alive. Scavenging. Medieval builders reused Roman bricks wherever they could find them, especially for religious buildings. Memory. Some knowledge of brickmaking survived in monasteries, where written records and experimentation slowly accumulated. Architecture. Roman brick buildings remained physically present, and their structural strength inspired imitation. So when brick finally re-emerged as a viable material in medieval England, it was not as a brand new idea, but as a recovered one. Brick's return, the medieval revival. The revival began slowly. The earliest post-Roman bricks in England appear in the 13th and 14th centuries, particularly in southeast England, Kent, Essex, Sussex regions close to Roman ruins. Notably, early brick revival buildings were often ecclesiastical monasteries, churches, priories, fortified residences, moated manor houses, commissioned by wealthy patrons or orders with continental ties. One of the earliest and most famous examples is Fleur Little Wenham Hall, c. 1270, Suffolk, built with bricks similar in size and shape to Roman types, likely made with imported techniques from the Low Countries. Used local clay, fired in small clamps, indicates a reintroduction of the skill through foreign masons or ecclesiastical networks. These early medieval bricks were often uneven, underfired, and irregular, a far cry from Roman precision. But they marked the beginning of a slow recovery. Books learning again, trial, error, and experimentation. Brickmaking knowledge had to be rebuilt from fragments. Observation of Roman remains. Trial and error with local clays. Adaptation of European methods, particularly from Flanders and northern France. Documents from the 14th and 15th centuries show kilns being rebuilt from scratch, often on a temporary per-project basis. Bricks made on site and fired in open-clamp kilns, often inconsistent in quality. Masons recording dimensions, firing times, and clay sources in guild ledgers and manuals. In this period, we see brickmaking emerge not as an industrial process, but as a craft passed between workers, refined over generations. The brick boom, Tudor England and beyond. By the Tudor period, late 15th, early 17th centuries, brick had gone from rarity to royal fashion. Japanese Castle Hampton Court Palace, begun 1515. Built largely from brick, with red and black checkerwork patterns, designed to reflect wealth and modernity. Inspired by continental Renaissance styles, but using native English clay. This period saw the rise of bricklayers' guilds, the standardization of brick sizes, improved kiln design, allowing more even and efficient firing, use of lime mortar that bonded well with clay brick. By the Elizabethan era, brick was being used in urban housing, schools, and town walls. Brick was no longer the language of the Roman soldier or the medieval monk. It was the dialect of expansion, trade, and national identity. DNA echoes of Roman technique. Despite centuries of separation, Roman brickmaking left subtle fingerprints on later British practices. Standard sizes. Tudor bricks were smaller than Roman ones but followed similar proportions, length 1.52 times width. This wasn't coincidence, it likely came from copying surviving Roman units still embedded in old walls. Kiln layouts. Some late medieval kilns reused Roman updraft designs, improving control over firing temperatures. Stamping and marking. While not as common, some Tudor bricks carried makers' marks, echoing the stamped bricks of Roman Londinium. Bonding patterns. Bricklaying styles such as Flemish bond and English bond may have developed independently, but Roman opus latericium, brick-faced concrete, showed similar patterns of layering and alignment. Even where memory failed, form survived. Adult school brick as a teacher. When archaeologists in the 19th and 20th centuries began to excavate Londinium in earnest, they found not just artifacts, but textbooks, ancient bricks teaching forgotten skills. Excavations revealed kiln failures that showed what went wrong, stacking patterns that revealed ancient labor techniques, clay analyses that helped rediscover local firing temperatures. In some ways, Roman bricks became instructors, silently explaining how to select the right soil, measure shrinkage, or lay a long wall without sagging. Every crack, stamp, and uneven edge offered a lesson. Brick's modern London, ancient foundations. Today, brick is the DNA of London. Walk through the city and you'll see Victorian terraces built with machine-fired red clay. Georgian mansions with neat, uniform-facing brick. Industrial warehouses with dark, soot-stained fire. Underground tunnels lined with glazed engineering brick. Beneath it all, sometimes literally, you'll find Roman lindenium's bricks, still holding their shape after nearly 2 millennia. In some places, Roman bricks were incorporated directly into newer buildings, visible in the lower courses of walls or foundations. The continuity is not just physical, it's conceptual, a belief that cities must be built to last, and that even the most boring materials can carry civilization. A bricklayer's legacy. The forgotten brickmakers of Roman lindenium left no memoirs. Their names are missing, their graves are unmarked. But their work is everywhere. In the recycled bricks of medieval chapels, in the dimensions of modern kilns, in the patterns of labor organization, in the endurance of London itself. Their story reminds us that infrastructure is not just stone, and steel its memory, repetition, and silent trust in the hands that work unseen. They didn't set out to shape the future. They simply made bricks, and in doing so, they laid the literal and cultural foundation for a city that would never quite forget how to build. Story 5. How the salt tax sparked a century of civil disobedience. You reach for the salt at your dinner table without thinking. A small crystal, a pinch of flavor. But for most of human history, salt wasn't seasoning, it was survival. It preserved food, tanned hides, disinfected wounds, and maintained the mineral balance in your blood. It was, quite literally, the difference between life and death. And because it was necessary, it was taxed, heavily, repeatedly, across empires and centuries. In this story, we follow salt not as a mineral, but as a trigger. A small, quiet, essential thing that provoked massive resistance, sometimes peacefully, sometimes violently, and helped shape the long history of civil disobedience. This is not just about Gandhi's Salt March. That came late. Before him, before protest as performance, there was a century of salt taxes that laid the groundwork for unrest, rebellion, and the birth of nonviolent resistance as a political tool. Why salt? Salt has been taxed for at least 2,000 years, from ancient China and Persia to medieval France and Mughal India. Why did rulers love taxing it? Universal demand. Everyone needed it: peasants, nobles, soldiers. Difficult to evade. Salt had to be mined, evaporated, or transported in bulk. Easy to control. Governments could monopolize salt production and distribution. Year-round consumption, not seasonal, unlike grain or wool. Taxing salt allowed empires to reach into the homes of even their poorest citizens, extracting revenue from the bottom of the economic ladder without needing an army of collectors. But this efficiency came at a cost: public resentment, especially when salt taxes were raised during times of war or famine. Japanese castle China's salt bureaucracy, order through monopoly. Let's begin in Tang and Song Dynasty China, 7th–13th centuries CE. Here, salt was so essential that the imperial government created a monopoly, controlling production sites, especially brine wells and sea salt fields. Licensed transport, regional pricing, retail distribution. A specialized bureaucracy, the Salt Administration, was established to regulate this flow. Salt revenues made up more than half the state's income in some periods. But salt taxes weren't simply collected. They were embedded in the price, artificially inflated, to ensure the state's cut. This system worked for centuries, but it also meant salt smugglers became organized and well-funded. Rural communities relied on illegal salt to survive. Regional unrest, especially during famine years, often began with salt riots. One notable episode occurred in the 9th century, when peasant revolts in the Yangtze region cited salt prices and government hoarding as key grievances. And still the system endured. Salt was too important. Its control meant stability, but also suppression. Adult medium sheaf India, the salt tax under the Mughals and the Raj. Next, we shift to India, where salt was similarly regulated, but under very different conditions. The Mughals had imposed taxes on salt for centuries, but it was under British colonial rule that the salt tax became especially hated. Key features of the British salt tax in India. The British created a monopoly in the 18th century. Salt production was restricted to government-licensed sites. A customs line known as the Inland Customs Hedge was built to prevent untaxed salt from moving between regions. By the 19th century, this hedge spanned 2,500 miles, complete with guards, checkpoints, and fencing made of thorny shrubs. This hedge, sometimes literally, a living fence of prickly plants, divided communities, slowed trade, and became a symbol of colonial intrusion into daily life. The salt tax affected every household, rich or poor. It especially burdened farmers who needed salt for cattle, laborers whose diets lacked other mineral sources, fisher folk who used salt to preserve catch, widows and poor women who often traded in small quantities of salt as income. By the late 1800s, salt tax revenue constituted up to 10% of colonial income. Fire the dandy spark would come later, but the friction began early. We often think of Gandhi's Salt March in 1930 as the beginning of resistance against the salt tax, but opposition began much earlier, and it was slow-burning, decentralized, and deeply local. Examples include Camel 1780s, Bengal salt smuggling. Local traders defied British licenses. Women hid salt under clothing, children carried it in baskets. Villagers staged nonviolent standoffs with hedge guards. Scroll 1820s, 1840s, pamphlets and pledges. Anti-tax tracts circulated among urban intelligentsia. Early reformers like Rajaram Mohan Roy criticized the salt monopoly as unjust and economically damaging. Civil petitions were sent to the East India Company, ignored, but preserved. Persian medium, late 19th century, local marches. Farmers in Gujarat and Bengal staged marches to salt pans, mimicking later tactics. These weren't national movements, they were localized assertions of livelihood rights. In these decades, the pattern of civil disobedience through salt was forming, not dramatic, but persistent. Adult light balanced salt and the legal limits of protest. Because salt laws were tied to property and customs codes, violating them often meant fines, confiscation of goods, imprisonment, especially for repeat offenses. British courts handled thousands of salt-related cases every year, many involved women arrested for carrying or selling untaxed salt, children caught crossing the hedge with bundles, entire villages fined collectively. Though these punishments were often small, they accumulated into a daily atmosphere of surveillance and frustration. Unlike other colonial taxes, the salt tax was felt in kitchens, not just markets. It targeted survival, not luxury. That made it emotional. It bred quiet resistance, not always organized, not always effective, but constant. Salt is symbol, the slow birth of a protest icon. By the early 20th century, Indian nationalists began to recognize that salt was more than a commodity, it was a perfect symbol. Universally needed. Tied to imperial oppression. Nonviolent in appearance. Easily replicable. Hard to suppress without brutality. Writers and organizers began to reference salt in essays, poetry, and speeches. The idea took shape. What if the poorest person broke the law, not with violence but by boiling seawater? This idea wasn't invented in 1930. It was cultivated over generations, in the quiet corners of Indian villages, in markets where taxes were argued over, and in courtrooms where housewives defended themselves for carrying a handful of crystals. But what happens when a symbol matures into a movement? We'll follow Gandhi's Salt March not just as a moment of resistance, but as the culmination of a long, often forgotten history of civil defiance, and how the world watched salt change politics forever. It is the morning of March 12, 1930, and you are standing on the edge of Sabarmati Ashram in Gujarat. A frail man in a white dhoti walks quietly ahead, carrying no weapons, no banners, and no rhetoric of war. Mohandas Karamchand Gandhi simply begins to walk, flanked by 78 volunteers. This is not a revolution of guns. This is a protest with salt. For 24 days they will walk 240 miles, not to seize a city, not to topple a king, but to bend down at the shores of Dandi, pick up salt from the ground and say clearly, peacefully, and illegally, "This is ours." This is the moment most people remember. But behind the Salt March is a century of quiet resistance, a deep history of salt taxes, legal oppression, smuggling, and economic strain that had simmered for generations. We explore how Gandhi transformed a centuries-old grievance into a singular political act, and how salt, the most basic mineral of life, became the instrument of global protest. Gandhi's strategic genius, why salt? It's important to understand that Gandhi's choice was not symbolic flair, it was practical genius. Why did he choose salt as the trigger? Universality. Everyone needed salt, rich, poor, Hindu, Muslim, Dalit, Christian. No one could say it was someone else's issue. Simplicity. Making salt was easy. All it required was seawater, sunlight, and patience. Illegality. The British Raj had outlawed personal salt production, even from one's own land. Nonviolence. The act of lifting a pinch of salt was both visually humble and legally potent. Historical pain. The salt tax had existed for generations, especially under British rule. Many Indians had long viewed it as the cruelest tax of all, a levy on survival itself. With salt, Gandhi aimed to wound the colonial state in the most ethical, visible, and irresistible way possible. Person medium male. The march begins, a walk through India's past and present. On March 12, 1930, Gandhi left Sabarmati with 78 followers. The route was deliberately public, passing through villages with long histories of colonial hardship, regions hit hardest by salt enforcement, areas where local movements had already been resisting. Each stop was more than a rest, it was a lesson. Gandhi used the march to educate, mobilize, and recruit. He spoke not of violence or conquest, but of self-purification, civil duty, defying unjust laws without hatred. Every village became a stage for India's new identity. People swept roads, sang hymns, offered water. By the time the march neared the coast, thousands were walking with him. Salt. April 6, 1930, the Salt Act is broken. On the morning of April 6, Gandhi rose before dawn. He walked to the shore of Dandi and in full view of police and press, he reached down, scooped up a clump of salty mud, and held it aloft. It was a crime, but it was also a moment captured by cameras, described by journalists, and echoed across the globe. Within days, thousands made or collected illegal salt. Markets sold contraband crystals wrapped in cloth. School children were arrested for gathering brine. Women led satyagraha protests at salt works. Salt works in Dharasana were non-violently stormed by volunteers, many of whom were brutally beaten in full view of foreign reporters. The point was not to defeat the British Empire. It was to expose its absurdities, to render its violence visible, and to show that even the simplest act of survival could be an act of defiance. Camera with flash. The global response. Salt goes viral, 1930s style. News of the Salt March and its aftermath spread quickly. The New York Times, the Manchester Guardian, and Time magazine ran front-page coverage. American writer Webb Miller, who witnessed the Dharasana beatings, reported, "Not one of the marchers even raised an arm to fend off blows. They went down like 10 pins." Global figures from Albert Einstein to W.E.B. Du Bois spoke in support of Gandhi's methods. For many outside India, this was the first time civil disobedience had been seen as a global force, not just dissent, but moral theater. SALT wasn't just the protest. SALT was the medium and the message. Busts in silhouette who made the movement, not just Gandhi. Though Gandhi was its architect, the SALT Satyagraha was sustained by thousands of ordinary Indians, many of whom had long histories of resisting the salt tax. Examples: Sarojini Naidu, a poet and political leader, led the charge at Dharasana after Gandhi's arrest. Women's groups organized salt-making across Bengal and Madras, turning domestic labor into public defiance. Untouchables Dalits, previously excluded from many nationalist movements, participated as equals boiling brine, standing in picket lines. Salt smugglers, once criminalized, now became folk heroes, reclaiming an economy that had long excluded them. This was not just Gandhi's march. It was a people's awakening, drawing from generations of hidden rebellion. Balanced legal consequences: arrest, imprisonment, and the rule of law. In the weeks following the SALT March, over 60,000 Indians were arrested. Gandhi himself was jailed on May 5, 1930. Salt production remained illegal, but the law had been publicly shattered. Yet the real power of the movement wasn't legislative, it was psychological. British administrators had built an empire on the premise of control, moral, economic, and administrative. With the Salt Satyagraha, that control cracked. The Raj was not defeated, but it was exposed. And once a regime is ridiculed, once its laws are shown to be laughably unjust, it is weakened beyond recovery. SALT as strategy, the blueprint for future protests. The SALT March didn't immediately end British rule, but it redefined protest for the modern age. It introduced core ideas that would inspire movements from Alabama to Johannesburg. Defy unjust laws openly. Accept punishment without retaliation. Use everyday materials to subvert authority. Invite the world to witness cruelty. Turn small, essential things like salt into symbols of collective dignity. SALT became the first truly global act of nonviolent resistance, studied by Martin Luther King Jr., Cesar Chavez, Václav Havel, Nelson Mandela. And yet at its heart it was deeply Indian, deeply local, deeply about food, family, and fairness. What changed after the march? While the SALT March didn't end the salt tax overnight, it irreversibly changed the political landscape. The British began negotiations with Gandhi at the Round Table conferences in London. The Indian National Congress emerged as the dominant voice for independence. The salt tax became a political liability, eventually repealed in stages. Gandhi's nonviolent method, once doubted, was now seen as the moral center of resistance. And most importantly, millions of Indians now believed in their ability to resist without violence. It was no longer just about salt. It was about agency. But what happened after the salt tax was gone? Did the act of civil disobedience truly change governance? Or did it leave behind a more complicated legacy, one that shaped post-colonial states as much as empires? When Gandhi picked up a handful of salt at Dandi, he didn't just break a law, he opened a door. That door led not just to Indian independence, but to a global understanding that laws are not automatically just, and that obedience is not always a virtue. It created a blueprint imperfect, evolving for how the governed might hold power to account without violence, and how a single act, grounded in necessity, might ripple through the machinery of empire. But what happened after the salt? What remained when the tax itself dissolved into history? This section examines the legacy of the salt tax and its protest, how it influenced governance, law, protest culture, and national memory, and how it raised uncomfortable questions that still resonate today. The salt tax is lifted, a quiet end to a loud law. After the Salt March of 1930 and the intense civil disobedience campaign that followed, the salt tax became a political embarrassment for the British Raj. However, it did not disappear overnight. Timeline of repeal: 1931–1935, limited concessions, some restrictions relaxed. 1935–1946, the tax remains in place but is poorly enforced in many regions. 1947, with Indian independence, the salt tax officially ends. Interestingly, many Indian leaders debated keeping the tax, arguing it was still a useful source of revenue. But the symbolism was too strong. Salt could never again be a tool of state control in the same way. So the tax was retired not just as policy but as a gesture, a way of saying, we understand what it meant. Classical: the New India, civil disobedience in governance. Post-independence India inherited not just colonial infrastructure, but also a complex relationship with authority. Gandhi's method had worked against the British, but what about against Indian authority? From the 1950s onward, a curious tension developed. Protest became enshrined in democratic rights, but civil disobedience against Indian law, especially by the poor or marginalized, was often treated harshly. New taxes and bureaucracies emerged, some of them echoing old colonial systems. The irony was clear. A nation born of protest was uneasy when protests targeted itself. Still, the idea of peaceful resistance remained in India's civic vocabulary. It was taught in schools, invoked in elections, and used by farmers, workers, and students alike. Salt had taught India how to say no not with fire, but with firmness. Globe showing Europe-Africa salt's global legacy, from Dandi to Selma. The true impact of the Salt March may be seen not just in India, but in the way it inspired movements around the world. Martin Luther King Jr. and the Civil Rights Movement. King read Gandhi's writings in the 1950s. He modeled Montgomery bus boycotts, sit-ins, and marches on the Satyagraha concept. In his own words, Christ gave us the goals and Gandhi the tactics. South Africa: Nelson Mandela and anti-apartheid struggles. Though Mandela initially supported armed resistance, the broader movement embraced civil disobedience tactics rooted in Gandhi's South African work and the Salt March. Symbolic acts: refusing pass laws, holding illegal meetings echoed the defiance of salt laws. Poland's solidarity in Poland, 1980s. The use of everyday symbols: bread, work, shipyards, mirrored Gandhi's choice of salt: simple, essential, non-militarized. Extinction Rebellion, Occupy, climate strikes. Modern protest movements often draw on the non-violent disruption tactics Gandhi helped popularize. Even the act of sitting down, blocking traffic, refusing to move, can trace a symbolic ancestry to those who knelt at salt pans and waited to be beaten. Salt taught the world that civil disobedience must be visible, repeatable, and tied to life's basics. But was it always peaceful? The gray zones of disobedience. It is tempting to remember the Salt March as purely moral, peaceful protesters, brutal colonial force, and a clear arc toward justice. But reality was messier. Some local protests escalated into violence, especially when police cracked down. British officials justified repression by highlighting these exceptions, using them to discredit the movement. Not all Indians supported Gandhi's approach. Some felt more militant tactics were needed. Civil disobedience sometimes hurt the very poor, who bore the brunt of legal retaliation and economic disruption. In this complexity lies a deeper truth. Civil disobedience is not always harmonious, and its outcomes are not always pure. But it offers a path, a way to resist when options seem exhausted. Salt, the salt of the earth, dignity in the mundane. What salt represented most powerfully was dignity in the everyday. Gandhi chose salt not because it was glamorous, but because it was universal and overlooked, the same reason ancient empires taxed it in the first place. By reclaiming salt, Indians reclaimed control over their bodies, ownership of their labor, the right to break laws when those laws broke them. Even today, when communities protest over water rights, housing, food prices, or farming practices, they often invoke the same logic. You may control the laws, but we control our survival. Salt was never just salt. It was the minimum and therefore the maximum moral demand. Dove, where do we go from here? Civil disobedience continues today, adapted, globalized, sometimes co-opted. But the quiet lesson of the salt tax remains. That state power can manifest in teaspoons, not just tanks. That resistance can be gentle and firm at once. That the right to survival is often the first freedom claimed in any movement. The brickmakers of Londinium built with silence. The salt gatherers of Dundee built with defiance. Both shaped the world not with spectacle, but with the long, slow insistence on dignity. But if salt could shake an empire, what else has been hiding in the margins of history? What other forgotten materials have shaped resistance, culture, or survival without ever demanding attention? Story 6. The postal route that united a continent and then disappeared. Imagine a letter, a simple parchment, sealed in wax, being carried hundreds of miles across rivers, mountains, and empire borders. Now imagine that letter moving faster than many armies, passing seamlessly from one horseman to another, from one way station to the next, each courier bound by law to get it there faster than the last. This was not the 1800s. This was ancient Rome. This is the story of the cursus publicus, Rome's vast and astonishingly efficient postal system. Created under Emperor Augustus, this network of relay stations and official couriers knit together one of history's greatest empires, from the chalky shores of Britannia to the burning sands of Egypt. But like many things Roman, it was both brilliant and brittle. It became a lifeline and then, quietly, a liability. A system once envied and admired disappeared almost entirely, leaving behind no ruins, no triumphs, and very few stories. In this section, we explore the birth of the cursus publicus, what it was, how it worked, and how it managed to quietly hold the empire together, one horse, one message at a time. The origins, Augustus and the architecture of communication. The cursus publicus, meaning public way, or state courier system, was formalized by Emperor Augustus around 20 BCE. Rome was already a vast state. It needed more than soldiers and roads to govern it. It needed information. Augustus realized this early. His solution wasn't to invent something new, but to systematize what had already been happening informally: messengers, provincial governors, writers, military scouts, and turn it into a centralized state service. This was not a postal system for everyone. There were no birthday cards or business letters. The cursus publicus was for government use only. Imperial commands, provincial updates, military reports, tax and census data, legal orders. It was, in a way, Rome's nervous system carrying signals from the imperial brain to its far-flung limbs. How it worked: relays, way stations, and horseshoes. The cursus publicus relied on a network of relay stations known as mutations and mansions. Mutations were small posts, usually just a place to change horses. Mansions were larger, offering food, lodging, and stables for longer rests. These were placed every 15-20 miles along the Roman road system, itself a marvel of engineering stretching over 250,000 miles. Messengers, known as cursors, would depart with a diploma, a metal or leather passport issued by the imperial office. Travel as fast as the route allowed, often on fresh horses at each station. Switch horses at mutations, rest or change riders at mansions. Deliver the message directly to its official recipient or to the next relay station if part of a long route. Speeds of 50 miles per day were common. In emergencies, the system could achieve over 100 miles per day faster than most medieval couriers 1,000 years later. And this wasn't just limited to Italy. The system connected Londinium, London, to Rome in under 30 days. Antioch to the Danube frontier in just 2 weeks. Carthage to Alexandria via sea and land couriers in coordinated rhythm. Scroll the diplomata, imperial passports and official privilege. To use the cursus publicus, one needed authorization usually in the form of a diploma, not unlike a modern diplomatic passport. These were issued only by the emperor, provincial governors, certain high-ranking magistrates. A diploma gave the bearer the right to use imperial horses and carts, demand services from relay stations, lodge at mansions without charge, receive priority over all other traffic. But abuse was common. As the empire expanded, so did the number of urgent messages and privileged travelers. Eventually, corruption crept in. Wealthy elites used the system for private travel, and governors issued fake or inflated orders to prioritize their own interests. What began as an empire-wide utility slowly became an elite convenience. Open mailbox with raised flag. What was sent? Messages that moved an empire. While we lack direct archives of cursus publicus messages, surviving records suggest a range of essential functions. Military dispatches, troop movements, supply requests, battle updates. Fiscal notices, census returns, tax adjustments, land records. Legal summons, court rulings, trial dates, exiles, pardons. Political orders, senatorial appointments, administrative reforms. Some notable events traveled this network. The news of Augustus's death in 14 CE was delivered to all provinces via cursus publicus riders. Military revolts on the Rhine and Danube were suppressed in part due to quick message relay. During plague outbreaks, local responses were coordinated via imperial couriers issuing quarantine orders. The cursus publicus wasn't flashy, but it kept the empire informed, responsive, and tethered to a central voice. Gear cost and maintenance. Who paid for all this? Maintaining the system was expensive. Initially, the Roman state covered most costs, but by the 2nd century CE, the burden began to shift. Local municipalities were expected to house and feed couriers. Provincial landlords were conscripted to provide animals and carts. Wealthy estates along the road routes had to maintain mansions. This caused quiet resentment. Farmers saw their animals seized. Inns were overrun. Officials stretched their budgets to accommodate couriers who increasingly arrived unannounced, unpaid, and often unwelcome. Over time, some regions avoided road development to escape these obligations, a rare case where being on the map meant higher taxes. The bureaucratization of travel, when everything becomes a form. By the 3rd century CE, the cursus publicus had evolved into a full imperial bureaucracy complete with inspectors, curators, supply officers, and record keepers. It was no longer just a courier network, it was an infrastructure of control. Travel within the empire now required official approvals, route logs, expense vouchers, validation of purpose. What had once been swift became sluggish under paper trails and suspicion. And yet, despite growing inefficiencies, no one dared dismantle it. It had become too vital to fail, even as it strained the empire's budget and fed public resentment. But how does something so massive disappear? In the next section, we'll follow the slow unraveling of the cursus publicus, how barbarian invasions, imperial fragmentation, and a changing world quietly erased the greatest communication network the ancient world had ever seen. By the end of the 3rd century CE, the cursus publicus was a creature of contradiction. It was still one of the fastest and most reliable communication systems in the world, yet it was bloated, expensive, and widely resented. It tied together an empire that, by many measures, was already beginning to unravel. In this section, we explore how the Roman postal system, a masterpiece of logistics and control, began to fray. Not through sabotage or dramatic upheaval, but through bureaucracy, budget strain, and the slow erosion of centralized power. It is a story not of collapse, but of disconnection, a lesson in how even the strongest systems fail, not with fire but with silence. The burden of the provinces. In its early decades, the cursus publicus was maintained largely through imperial funding. But by the 3rd century, local communities bore the brunt. Horse and cart owners were forced to loan animals to relay stations, often without pay. Landowners near mansions had to provide lodging, fodder, and meals for messengers and their teams. Municipal treasuries were expected to maintain way stations and roads. As the empire faced increasing military and economic pressure, especially during the crisis of the 3rd century, 235–284 CE funding dwindled. Provincial cities, already under financial strain, began to skimp on maintenance, delay supplies, and even abandon posts. In some cases, citizens sabotaged roads or allowed mansions to fall into disrepair simply to avoid the obligation of hosting couriers. Chart decreasing overuse and corruption. What began as an elite privilege slowly became a gray market of access. Originally, only imperial messengers with a valid diploma could legally use the system, but by the 4th century, governors issued false or duplicate passes. Military officers used the network for personal travel. Wealthy elites bribed officials to gain access for business purposes. Roman Emperor Diocletian, known for his administrative reforms, attempted to curb these abuses. He imposed strict quotas, reassigned bureaucrats, and enforced new systems of verification. But the problem was systemic. There were too many roads, too few inspectors, and too many powerful interests who refused to follow rules. The cursus publicus became clogged, its speed reduced, its reliability questioned. Shield military pressure and frontier disruption. As barbarian groups Goths, Vandals, Franks, Huns pressed on the empire's borders, the military increasingly commandeered the system. The postal relay became a logistics backbone for moving troops quickly, delivering rations to forts, sending urgent orders between generals. But this repurposing pushed the civilian communication function to the side. In the West, especially in Gaul and Britannia, barbarian raids disrupted routes. Roads were no longer safe. Stations were abandoned. Horses were requisitioned for cavalry rather than post. By the mid-4th century, large swaths of the Western Empire had no functioning postal system at all. In response, local governors created informal replacements, personal messengers, merchant runners, or even military scouts. But these were fragmented, slow, and limited in reach. The unified voice of Rome, once echoed through its highways, was becoming a whisper. Scroll the bureaucratization of collapse, reforms that failed. Several emperors attempted to rescue the cursus publicus, but with mixed results. Constantine the Great, R 306-337 CE. Tried to separate public from private use. Issued new types of metallic diplomas to prevent forgery. Re-established funding channels through imperial estates. But these reforms failed to address the core issue, a shrinking center trying to control an expanding burden. Valentinian I, R 364-375 CE. Introduced a dual-track system. One for light, fast couriers, cursus velox. One for slower, heavier transport, cursus clabularis. This acknowledged a growing reality. Some routes could no longer be traveled quickly. Speed was no longer uniform. Rome was no longer uniform. Even the bureaucracy had adapted to decline. The last messages: end of an empire, end of a network. By 395 CE, the Roman Empire had been permanently split into eastern and western halves. Each managed its own roads, governors, and messengers. In the east, what would become the Byzantine Empire, the cursus publicus, continued for centuries under the name dromos, though it gradually morphed into a diplomatic and military network rather than a postal service. In the west, however, the end came more quickly. 410 CE, the Visigoths sacked Rome. Though symbolic, it marked a loss of confidence in Roman security. 455 CE, the Vandals attacked again, this time by sea. 476 CE, the last Roman emperor in the west, Romulus Augustulus, was deposed. With no empire, no central authority, and no consistent road maintenance, the cursus publicus quietly vanished. There was no great funeral, no final message. It simply faded station by station. What remained? Roads without riders. Oddly, the Roman road, so central to the cursus publicus, outlived the system itself. For centuries, pilgrims, monks, and merchants still walked the paths once taken by imperial messengers. Many medieval roads across Europe follow the exact trajectory of old Roman routes. The Via Appia in Italy, the Waddling Street in Britain, the Via Augusta in Spain. But the stations were gone, the relay horses long vanished, the imperial diploma meaningless. In a way, Rome's mail system is an example of infrastructure that becomes ghost infrastructure. Still present, still walked, but without purpose, without memory. Brain lessons from a forgotten system. Why does the collapse of the cursus publicus matter? Because it reminds us that communications matter more than armies. Power is coordination. Empire is not territory, but the ability to connect across it. And perhaps most critically, even the most efficient systems, without constant care, become too big to maintain. What was once a marvel of the ancient world, a symbol of unity, discipline, and mobility, became a burden, then a shell, and finally a memory. But how did Rome's ability to communicate so quickly for centuries leave so little behind? And what did the people of the early Middle Ages do when they no longer had roads that led to power, but only to the past? By the end of the 5th century CE, the Roman cursus publicus was gone. There were no proclamations, no burning of archives, no ceremonies. The last message was sent, the last horse trotted into a crumbling station, and then nothing. But while the cursus publicus disappeared, the idea it represented, state-controlled, high-speed communication across vast distances, left behind long, shallow routes. And those routes, over time, would grow again. This final section explores how Rome's postal system influenced, haunted, and eventually resurfaced in the centuries that followed. It is a story not of immediate legacy, but of slow rediscovery, of how ideas vanish beneath the surface only to be quietly dug up, centuries later, when the world is ready. Roads to nowhere, the skeleton of an empire. The physical infrastructure of the cursus publicus, its roads, was too substantial to vanish completely. The Via Appia, Via Flaminia, Via Augusta, and dozens of other stone arteries remained mostly intact. In Britain, Watling Street, Ermine Street, and Fosse Way were slowly overgrown but still walkable. Bridges, stone mile markers, and way station ruins dotted the landscape. But without centralized upkeep, many roads became unsafe or impassable. Travelers risked banditry, hostile tribes, and simple disuse. Way stations decayed. Horses went untrained. Messaging became hyperlocal again. By the 7th century, even kings could not move faster than a peasant cart. The church steps in, monasteries as way stations. As the Roman state faded, the Catholic Church became the de facto keeper of literacy, knowledge, and order in many parts of Europe. But the Church also understood the value of communication, and so, in subtle ways, it revived parts of the Roman postal legacy. Monasteries were often placed near old Roman roads, using them to reach scattered Christian communities. Bishops and abbots sent runners or riders with ecclesiastical messages, decrees, excommunications, and appeals. Certain abbeys began acting as informal relay points, where messengers could rest and switch horses. This system was never as formal or wide-reaching as the cursus publicus, but in a fragmented Europe, it was often the only working method of long-distance messaging. And critically, the Church remembered the Roman idea: messages matter, infrastructure matters, roads and stations, even forgotten ones, can still carry meaning. Scroll Carolingian experiments, Charlemagne's mini-Rome. In the 8th and 9th centuries, Charlemagne attempted to rebuild a version of the Roman state in Western Europe. Among his many reforms, including currency, law, and education, was the creation of a messaging system for his empire. He built royal roads connecting Aachen to Paris, Lyon, and northern Italy. He appointed missi dominici envoys of the king, who traveled with imperial authority. He placed monastic relay stations along key routes, mimicking mansions. The Carolingian postal service was small, elite-focused, and limited in reach, but its inspiration was Roman. Charlemagne likely never saw the cursus publicus, but his scholars read Roman law, copied Roman architecture, and used the same roads Rome had laid. For a brief moment, messages flowed again, not across a continent, but through a king's vision of unity. Of the slow rise of the medieval courier. By the 11th century, messaging began to evolve again, not under emperors, but under merchants. Trade guilds, universities, and banking families began using trusted messengers between cities, seal rings, and coded symbols to verify documents, horse exchanges in major towns. The House of Tasso, a wealthy merchant family in the 13th century, established a courier service for the Holy Roman Empire, one that directly descended from Roman principles. By the 15th century, the Tasso network, later Thurn und Taxis, ran a pan-European postal system, arguably the first since the cursus publicus. Their success came from combining private funding, public service, official backing. In this way, the Roman idea re-emerged, but this time through capitalism rather than empire. Books memory without memory, when systems leave no story. Despite its vastness, the cursus publicus left almost no cultural imprint. There are no great Roman plays or poems about couriers. No monuments to messengers or mansions. Few surviving inscriptions or tombs. Unlike Roman legions or aqueducts, the postal system was invisible by design. Its value was speed and silence. It was a conduit, not a destination. So while its roads remained, its role was forgotten. This absence is a reminder. Not all infrastructure leaves stories. Some of the most vital things in history disappear not because they failed, but because they were never meant to be seen. Counterclockwise arrows button echoes in modern systems. Today's global postal and logistics networks, FedEx, DHL, USPS, La Poste, and countless others owe silent tribute to the Roman model. Many of their design features were anticipated. Hub-and-spoke routing, official credentials for carriers, way stations for refueling and transfer, legal protection for state correspondence. And in the age of the internet, we've built digital versions of the cursus publicus instant, sprawling, yet equally vulnerable to decay, overload, and misuse. Perhaps the most modern lesson from the Roman postal collapse is this: speed and scale mean nothing without maintenance. The message only matters if it arrives. Brain Reflections, the value of connection. In the end, the cursus publicus was not just a postal system. It was the architecture of coordination. It allowed governors to receive orders in time to act, generals to respond to crises before they became disasters, a distant emperor to remain a presence in the lives of people he would never meet. Its collapse was not sudden. It was gradual, quiet, and deeply human. As Rome fragmented, people stopped writing to each other, not because they didn't care, but because they couldn't be heard. In an age of instant messaging and overwhelming connectivity, perhaps the most boring yet haunting question remains: what happens not when we talk too much, but when no one's left to listen?